This session is going to concentrate on the context, history and evolution of access to information practice, policy and legislation. How has it evolved over time? How has the global growth of these laws affected the legal policy framework? In addition, obviously, to being in this room, the session is being live streamed. My name is Andrew Ecclestone, and I'm a Senior Associate in the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. I've worked on freedom of information now for 30 years, including 12 years in the New Zealand Ombudsman's Office, where 16 years ago I was lucky enough to be organised with one of these things, and I'm still recovering. I am joined by an esteemed panel from a number of ATI bodies in different jurisdictions and from civil society. On my immediate right is Martina Schlögl, head of the Freedom of Information Division of the German Federal Commission for Data Protection and Freedom of Information. To her right is Gitanjali Gutierrez, Information Commissioner of Bermuda. On my left is Catherine Fletcher, Information Commissioner for Western Australia. And to her left is Professor Jean-Claude, President of the Executive Committee of the African Parliament for Civil Society. And we also have a pre-recorded video at some point in this session from Alina Seymour, who is Director of the Office of Government Information Services in the US National Archives and Records Administration. Without any further ado, I am going to kick off with our first part of this, which is not sticking to the pre-arranged questions, is going to be a conversation with myself and Martina about development of freedom of information in Germany. And how it's gone in different stages and different attitudes in different parts of the country, different levels, I think. So perhaps the first question is, when did the Federal Republic get its freedom of information law compared to some of the states or Länder in Germany, and how has that developed from your perspective?
Hello everybody, thank you for the kind introduction and thank you for having me. I'm glad to share the German perspective on the evolution of FOI. So you already mentioned it. It's a quite recent development in Germany. So unlike the Scandinavian states, we are not the fastest one when it comes to disclosure and when it comes to opening up. The German Federal Act reached force in 2006. But as you all know, Germany was divided into two parts. So after World War II, there was this communist part of Germany, and there was the Western part, the democratic part. And after the breakdown of the wall in 1989 and the reunion in 1990, there was a very interesting and fascinating development, because the former communist states that were really suffering repression, they were the first ones to pass freedom of information laws, because they wanted to build trust, and they realized it is so necessary after this period of suppression to open up and to build a society on peace. You also need to disclose and open archives so that people can realize what has been going on, and that there will be responsibility for all the crimes being committed. So it was Brandenburg, the first state in 1998 that had passed the Freedom of Information law, and then the other ones were following. And this led to the interesting or fascinating or sad situation that we have three different levels of freedom of information in Germany. So I do come from the very south, where the mountains are and where we drink beer and have sausages for breakfast. And this is the state that still does not have any freedom of information law at all. There is no access to public documents in Bavaria, and there is still no access to public documents in Lower Saxony, which is a quite big state with 10 million inhabitants. Then we have the states of the former West Germany with regular access to information law, so you have to make a request in order to obtain information. And then we have a couple of states, the light tower states that have proactive disclosure and more transparency laws. One is Hamburg. There was a big scandal. They were building a concert hall, costs were exploding, and it was a really grassroots movement. People were annoyed that so much money was spent. It was an absolutely most transparent way of planning this concert hall. And people were basically writing a transparency law, and it was public demanding this law, and they put it into force. And that was our procedure. So, short summary, 3 levels from you have no right to get anything to proactive disclosure of everything online, available 24/7.
How is at the federal level, where you're working on in the supervisory agency, how do you think the situation at the federal level has been evolving since the law was passed? Do you see a culture change towards acceptance of freedom of information? Are you seeing government agencies supportive of the objectives? Or are they still seeing this very much as a reactive thing, or if we've been found to infringe somebody's rights, then we have to deal with that?
Well, I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a lawyer, but lawyers always say it depends. That's what I've heard. From various conversations with all those wonderful people here, we found out that it's an opposition thing to ask for a strong right to access information. And there's this sudden amnesia as soon as parties will be elected and they are in the government. And so right now we have a new coalition, and it's a brand new phenomenon. We have the Green Party, the Socialists, and the Liberals. And they have a coalition contract where they gave themselves, where they obliged themselves to pass a transparency law 2.5 years ago. And we are still we're waiting for a framework or like 10 key aspects to be provided. We're trying to be as pushy as possible without being impolite. So we are inviting them to our conferences to report on their focus. But yeah, it's always this phenomenon. So putting it into the big picture, we've had this conversation before. When you look at those rankings, the German legal framework on federal level is very poor. I think what we make out of it is quite good and quite okay, because we're really dedicated to it, and we have a commissioner who's really in favor of freedom of information, and we all know this helps if that person, if the head of the commission or the commissioner is interested into this topic and is pushing it and is willing to face conflicts, then it helps FOI, even if the legal framework is average. But sure, I think it would be good if Germany, as center of the European Union, as a quite big country, would have a modern legal framework, because we hope this will be a strong sign within the European Union.
I mean, that's interesting. Like, coming from New Zealand, this idea of what parties promise when they're in opposition being different from what they have in government. I see lots of nodding heads in the room. It's generally the case, and New Zealand's an exception. We have had a government in office for the last 6 years that, when it was spending 9 years in opposition, kept talking about problems with the Access to the Official Information Act and how it wanted to strengthen it. And in its first term of office, it ran a consultation on should we have a review. Not we'll get on and strengthen the law, not we will have the review, but should we have a review. And the outcome of that, where I had to make a request to get the submissions to government, they didn't proactively publish the submissions, I had to ask them, was eventually, yes, we agreed that there would be a review. But after the 2020 general election, the Minister was faced with a raft of policy priorities in the Ministry of Justice and said, conducting that review is beyond our capacity. And so 3 years on, we still haven't had a review of the Official Information Act. But in the meantime, since 2017, we've had legislation that's contained more than 30 provisions which have nibbled away at our rights of access to information, either by creation of new bodies that aren't subject to the law, or by exempting certain information from the law, or by passing a law which contains a prohibition of disclosure, which the Official Information Act can't override. And so it's difficult in evaluating what's going on in access to information to necessarily be positive, but at the same time, this is a government that's passed a cabinet office circular that says cabinet papers will be published 30 business days after the decision is taken, unless there's good reason to continue to withhold them. And that in itself has been a big step change. It's completely outside the legal framework of the Official Information Act. but there's not many countries, particularly from a Westminster tradition, who can say we get proactive publication of cat papers. So we'll move on, and I think there's several of our panelists wanted to address the second question, which was about expansion freedom information laws around the world. Next to Catherine Fletcher, Information Commissioner from Western Australia, who has some powerful slides.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you again to the ICIC for the invitation to speak at today's panel and for hosting the conference. It's really fabulous to meet so many people from around the world and get to know a little bit more about your systems and how we can all support each other. We've got lots of issues in common. So yes, I do have some slides. I will just take you essentially through the systems that exist in Australia and also New Zealand. So I did see my New Zealand colleagues, and of course Andrew, as he said, is from New Zealand, and I'm grateful that he's spoken a little bit about the New Zealand system. So if I can go to that first slide, or perhaps the second slide. First slide's only a title slide. Thank you. The second slide there, just to give you all, people joke about us being down under, but we are down under in Australia and New Zealand. But we're very close neighbours, and it's just useful, I suppose, to get a bit of perspective. The different colouring on the maps there shows you that we have some sub-national jurisdictions in Australia, and I'll come to those in a moment. But just starting with the national bodies, it's important to understand that Australia has a National Information Commissioner that deals with several areas: freedom of information, privacy, and also information management in federal agencies. So we have a federation, states and territories, but this national body deals with requests for access to information from federal agencies. And in New Zealand, of course, as Andrew's already mentioned, the Ombudsman is the body. It's a unitary system in, there aren't sub-national bodies in New Zealand, so it's just one Ombudsman for the one system that deals with FOI, and also the General Ombudsman jurisdiction that many of you will be familiar with. If we move to the next slide, this talks about the sub-national jurisdictions within Australia. So each of the Australian state and territory information commissioners operate independent of each other under different legislation. Now, I come from Western Australia, obviously on the big chunk of land that you can see there. We're an enormous state. And with vast distances, and our capital, Perth, is in the very southwest corner, or close to the southwest corner of Western Australia. Huge distances in Australia, a very disperse but small remote population, but very far away from our capital cities, particularly in Western Australia. Northern Territory is the Information Commissioner of Northern Territory. We have the Office of the Information Commissioner in Queensland. We have the Information and Privacy Commissioner in New South Wales, and the Commissioner from New South Wales is at this conference today, Mrs. Elizabeth Tidd. And we have the Victorian Office of the Victorian Information Commissioner in Joanne Carmel, who is the Deputy Access Commissioner in Victoria, is also at this conference as well. And we have, still on the mainland of Australia, we have the South Australian Ombudsman, who deals with freedom of information and also the General Ombudsman jurisdiction. And coming down off the mainland, that little sort of triangle-shaped island at the bottom is Tasmania. And Tasmania also has an ombudsman who deals with information access law as well as the ombudsman jurisdiction. So that just gives you a bit of an idea. All of those sub-national jurisdictions, if perhaps we can go to the next slide, as I say, they each operate under their own legislation, and that is a table. I'm sorry, there's a lot of writing on that, and it's difficult to read in the context of this presentation. But it just demonstrates that we've each got our own legislation. We each, of course, have our own parliament that makes that legislation. What I thought was important to point out was that we're at various stages in the journey of development of access to information around Australia. So I asked all of my counterparts in other jurisdictions to characterise, in their view, where they were in that journey. And we talked about first generation being pull-type legislation based on access requests, and I'm sure some of you might use similar sort of terminology, versus second or subsequent generation legislation, which is more about proactive disclosure, push, shorthand, push style of legislation. So that table there just gives you a bit of an overview, and it's about half and half, first and second generation. There are some jurisdictions who are now looking at reviewing their second generation legislation, and they will have, third generation legislation. I'm not quite sure what that will look like, but certainly in the jurisdiction that I come from, Western Australia, we still have essentially first generation access request based. We have some publication requirements, but they're not extensive. And there's no powers of follow-up enforcement of the Information Commissioner in respect of those information provisions. But access requests for access to information, that's primarily how we respond in Western Australia. We'd like to see some reform, and I've got some comments about reform soon. So if we can move to the next slide. I just thought I would let you know as well, it's wonderful, these types of discussions, because we get to talk about our cooperation, of course, at the global level, but we also cooperate within Australia and New Zealand, which is not surprising. We get along pretty well, which is good. And some of the examples of that collaboration, well, there's a body that we call the Association of Information and Access Commissioners, the AICIC. And that's the New Zealand Ombudsman and the Australian Federal, State and Territory Access to Information bodies. And some of the examples of collaboration exist there. We have a jurisdictional compendium, which I would really recommend to those who are interested. It's essentially a table that goes across all of our legislation and sort of lines up, if you like, or provisions around establishment of the Information Commissioner, the powers of the Information Commissioner, the reporting responsibilities, the production of documents provisions. So it's quite a useful table for comparing our legislation. So last updated in 2021. We recently collaborated on open by design principles. So even though we have variations in our legislation, we all are essentially under our legislation at liberty to promote proactive disclosure, even if it's not mandated. So we each make some effort to do that. And we developed these open by design principles, which we've all taken on board and promoted to our respective jurisdictions. And that was at the end of 2021, close to the end. Recently, including New Zealand, so the first two initiatives were Australia only. The third initiative that I've mentioned here is a joint communique, which we tend to do at the end, or we started to do more recently, I should say, at our AIAC meetings. So a statement about what are our priorities, what's the focus for the group, and I was really pleased to see that we were able to include recently some comments in our communique about international engagement. And I think, I've talked already today to a number of people about the really interesting position that as a sort of outpost of Britain once upon a time, Australia and New Zealand, we sit in the Asian region. And I think that's really important, an Asia Pacific region. And I think we ought to, step up really and make more of that and support our neighbours. Some of whom have still got, some road to go in terms of developing access to information law. And I think we can also learn a lot from our neighbours. So I'll just make that point there about international engagement. We produced a video that's there for you to see. It's under a minute, and it's interesting in that it's generic. We've been able to, despite our differences and variations in our law, produce a sort of high-level principles info video, if you like. And I commend that to you to have a look, because I think those sorts of tools are really useful to getting the message out to the public about the system and the availability of access to information to the general public. And we have open government initiatives as well. So I'm sure everyone here is well aware of the Open Government Partnership. Australia is a member. Australia has has fallen behind in its commitment to the Open Government Partnership in recent years. I'm pleased to say that the Albanese government that was recently elected at the federal level has recommitted to developing Australia's third National Action Plan. So it's overdue, and I hate to think what would have happened if we had delayed any further, but that's apparently due for finalisation at the end of this year. So that's good. And we do a couple of projects in pursuance to the objectives that we've outlined in earlier national action plans. One of them is to develop national metrics about information access in Australian jurisdictions. I think that's very interesting because you see some very definite trends between push and pull legislation, you know, and I won't go into all the details here, but there are some charts that are developed, and it's 7 years now of data. And I think that's very interesting to see the difference between push and pull legislation in terms of the rate of use of information access and also the rate of external review to independent information commissioners is also one of the 6 metrics that's included in there. Those I find most interesting. Finally, information access surveys about not specifically FOI, but to what extent is the public interested in accessing information and how do they go about accessing information. So we've got 3 years worth of data there as well across most of our jurisdictions in Australia. And of course we do the usual promoting information, International Access to Information Day. Look, I am conscious of time, Andrew, and the last 2 slides have a lot of detail, which I'm hoping these slides will get shared with you, but they provide examples of what some of my colleagues in jurisdictions, all of these jurisdictions that I'm talking about, the Commonwealth of Australia, the New Zealand Ombudsman, and the subnational jurisdictions of Australia, some of their features of their access to information or that they find particularly effective. And I think it would be very interesting if you'd like to have a look. So there's 2 slides. If we can just perhaps jump to the next slide, you'll see some examples of that. But I'm conscious that we've got an open session we've got to get through. So, and just to finally conclude, the last slide is that, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, some of the jurisdictions are particularly actively seeking reform of our legislation. Those of us that are in first generation have legislation that is now 40 years old. And you know, we all know here, better than anybody, that the information environment has changed considerably. And also the public expectations about transparency and accountability in government has changed considerably. So that's a great thing. So let's leverage off that to get some reform. So trust in government, critical for delivery of digital services. Again, another critical lever behind reform of our systems. So Andrew, that's all I have to say. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think there's some useful points there in terms of shifts in the development of FOI and in terms of these, what can be characterised as first generation pull laws, where it's almost exclusively focused on making requests versus second generation newer laws that have been developed thinking about pushing out information. We might broadly characterise those as creating close rival of the web, but that doesn't mean to say that we aren't seeing push models in countries with older laws, but which are developed outside the legal framework. New Zealand is one of those. There's a lot of proactive publication pushing out of information, but it's outside the legal framework of the FOI law, which means that if something changes, you've got no right to complain to an information commission. I'd like to pass over now to Claude to make his presentation. He's going to speak in French and we'll have consecutive translation.
Je suis très heureux d'être là ce soir. Je sais que la plupart d'entre vous, depuis le début, c'est la première fois qu'on entend le français.
I'm very happy to be here with you all tonight, and I believe for some of you, this is the first time to hear French.
Alors, je pense que cet après-midi, l'Afrique, parce que j'estime que je suis invité ici pour porter une voix. Et une voix là, c'est sur la question de l'accès à l'information.
I believe that I have been invited here to bring a voice from Africa regarding access to information.
Alors, on me demande de parler des avancées sur le plan mondial. Je vais donner un point de vue important.
I've been asked to speak about the advances on the international level, and I would like to point out an important
À mon sens, avant de dire rapidement mon texte, à mon sens, l'Afrique a des priorités qui sont vraiment ailleurs.
Before I start presenting my
Cependant,
I would like to emphasize that
vous constatez comme moi qu'il y a beaucoup d'avancées. Quant au traité concernant l'accès à l'information, l'Afrique signe tous les traités, nos gouvernements signent tous les traités.
In Africa, we sign all the treaties,
Mais là où il y a un problème,
but the problem comes up
c'est dans l'exécution
when it
dans nos
comes
pays des traités que nous
execution
signons.
in the countries of which we sign.
Dès l'instant où nous sommes d'accord que ceux qui apportent l'aide au développement sont les pays occidentaux, dès que nous prêtons des traités, nous les signons.
When it is a Western country offering aid to us for development, we are in agreement and we sign the
Et
treaty.
donc, sur le plan administratif, il y a des avancées. On dit qu'il y a vraiment des avancées.
So on the administrative level, we have really made a lot of
Parce que sur le plan
advances,
administratif, tout le mécanisme est mis en place.
because on the administrative level, all the mechanisms have already been put in place.
Est-ce que dans les faits, dans nos pays, l'accès à l'information est une réalité?
But in our country, access to information, reality is different.
Quand je commence par dire que l'Afrique a des priorités ailleurs, je viens d'un pays où 3 des pays limitrophes sont gouvernés par des militaires.
So as I was saying earlier, in Africa, the access to information is a different aspect because we are bounded by 3 countries which are ruled militarily.
Et donc, à partir de là, le constat que nous pouvons faire, oui, ces pays ont signé comme 120 autres pays pour les traités relatifs
So
à l'accès à l'information. Je vais donc lire et ça va être facile. C'est bon? Je veux que je lise comme ça. Ok, je dis donc tous les pays limitrophes ont signé les traités relatifs à l'accès à l'information.
all the countries surrounding Ivory Coast have signed the treaties regarding access to information.
Le Mali a signé le traité.
Mali,
Le Burkina a signé.
Burkina,
La Guinée a également signé.
Guinea, they have all
La Côte
signed.
d'Ivoire a signé.
We have also signed in
Cependant,
Côte d'Ivoire.
cependant,
However,
les gouvernements ont encore la gestion, je dirais, difficile de l'information parce que c'est une question de survie puisqu'ils ont affaire au terrorisme dans le monde.
but when it comes to managing access to information for the government, it is difficult because of the surrounding terrorist environment.
Cependant, nous reconnaissons
We recognize, however,
que l'accès à l'information est un droit important.
that access to information is a very important right.
Mais c'est très difficile pour ces pays de suivre le rythme des pays développés que
But it's very difficult for our country to follow the other countries who have already gone towards
à la
this
mesure
network.
où nous estimons que nos priorités sont ailleurs.
Because we believe that our priorities are elsewhere.
C'est pourquoi ces pays estiment qu'envoyer des émissaires à des conférences comme ça, ce serait peut-être jeter de l'argent. C'est pourquoi ces États estiment qu'envoyer des émissaires à des conférences importantes comme ça, ce serait donc jeter de l'argent.
Okay, this is the reason why our country believes that sending representatives like myself to conferences, international conferences like this one, is a waste of money.
I'd like to now turn to Gitanjali from Bermuda, who will be last how many minutes? 10 minutes, yeah, we're okay. But Gitanjali has assured me that her talk is 8 to 10 minutes, so we'll be fine to wrap up.
Will be even shorter, so in light of the time. So it's a pleasure and honor to speak with you, and I want to thank the Freedom of Information Philippines for organizing and bringing us together today. I'm going to speak from my perspective as a member of the executive committee for the ICIC, and as the first information commissioner for a small jurisdiction, Bermuda, that's a geographically isolated country with one of the newer ATI regimes. We adopted our law in 2010 and it went into effect in 2015. We adopted many of the provisions of model ATI legislation, but we have seen with our implementation both successes and challenges. So in many ways, when we're asked to consider whether there's trends or reforms that need to happen to policy and legal frameworks, from my perspective, I would say that we really need to focus on the implementation of our existing ATI legal frameworks and policy frameworks. That the implementation, and I'll pick up where my colleague left off, that it's the implementation of good policies and good legal frameworks that really has the biggest impact right now on a citizen's access to public information. So I'm going to skip ahead and say that the expectation is well established that modern governments and public institutions at the local, national, and international level at this point should adopt an ATI framework. That includes the essential elements that we see now in model laws that have been adopted by NGOs and also now have been produced in regions. So we have the African model legislation that reflects regional, cultural, political, and geographic specificities. Governments and other public authorities often maintain a public commitment to ATI policy, transparency, and accountability that is rarely under a threat. That political commitment is not under threat. But on a micro level, citizens may be facing subtle or not so subtle barriers to exercising their rights to access to information. So when viewed in isolation, these logistical or administrative barriers may seem reasonable, and they often can be rationalized with reference to local circumstances. So these barriers might include the inability to make an access request anonymously. That may make sense, but if you're in a country where retaliation is feared, this becomes a barrier to access. It might include the need to pay a statutory fee for the cost of a search or processing a request. But if this happens in a country with poor record-keeping practices, or public officers who lack the training to efficiently process a request, this becomes a barrier to a citizen's access. There may be a need for a fee, even a small fee to be paid, but it needs to be paid to a centralized office as a first step before then processing an access request. It might include a requirement to present a written request to a particular office, or offering an extended time for access requests to be processed. Any one of these barriers, again, can be rationally explained, but that does not diminish the profound impact that these can have on the realization of the right to public information. Other implementation challenges, and we've heard this referred to today, can result in subtle or expressed weakening of the ATI guarantee bodies, which then reduces the capacity for them to impose consequences on public authorities for the failures to meet the requirements of ATI frameworks. This may range from a reduction in funding, amendments that limit the scope of the ATI law or the application to particular offices or departments, and that in turn reduces the guarantee body's remit. It might lead to a delay in appointing commissioners, as we've seen in Mexico and other jurisdictions, that leaves a body without legal capacity to exercise their remit. It might be the refusal to afford the guarantee body order-making authority so that they only have the capacity to make recommendations, but not a legal enforcement mechanism, and so on. And in practice, such measures related to the implementation of ATI framework may disenfranchise people more from their rights than changes or gaps in the legal framework itself. And so I always get concerned that we can become too academic and forget the people who are at the heart of the rights that are being exercised. The other emerging developments, I think, that impact the promotion and safeguarding of ATI laws include the development of data protection frameworks, progress on open government concepts, and the rapid emergence of artificial intelligence in public sector decision-making. These are hot topics, so to speak, and have an impact on how we understand the right to access public information. But I want to question the impact of these developments from a different perspective. My office only has remit for access to information, and I query whether these issues might, in some countries or some contexts, create the possibility that our focus is turned away from some of the core efforts that could improve ATI rights for the average person. As an information commissioner who focuses exclusively on regulating access to information, I do not need to decide how to allocate staffing, financial, and administrative resources in my office between access to information and data protection. For a small commissioner's office like Bermuda's, this has been crucial to advancing public access to information. It is much more difficult in smaller jurisdictions or with smaller offices to maintain robust access to information programs when an office is also tasked with the implementation and oversight of emerging data protection frameworks. Governments that are actively working to improve or adopt data protection frameworks may allocate sufficient resources to this effort, but may not do the same for ATI rights. Are governments allocating resources such as staff, funds, office space, equipment, training to support its data protection, cybersecurity, and AI projects at an equal level with its training, resources, and staffing of public officers addressing access to information? And the challenge is not to under-resource data protection or AI projects, not at all, but to recognize that in some instances, the perception within the government and perhaps the public may be that there is a pool of resources for information rights work, and a larger portion of it may be allocated to programs other than access to public information. Along these lines, open government initiatives are critical for increasing transparency, and governments may choose to locate their commitment to openness and transparency within their open government initiatives. But these initiatives, I would argue, cannot take the place of ATI rights. Open government is a context in which governments choose what they want to share with the public. This is different than the public's rights under ATI laws to ask the government for what they want to know. We must be cautious to avoid the risk that governments promote accountability and transparency primarily through open government, but do not equally promote public scrutiny through the rights exercised under ATI regimes. And so I know this is going back a little bit to an old school approach, but with many of these issues addressed locally, how can we meet these challenges on an international level? The establishment of the ICIC Charter in 2019 to create a permanent body of information commissioners provides the opportunity for the development of international standards for the implementation of ATI policy. The emergence of regional information commissioners networks, including in Asia, allows for the adoption of geographical implementation standards that may better account for cultural, historical, geographic, and geopolitical contexts. There is an opportunity here. As more bodies are promoting open government and proactive publication, information commissioners have the opportunity to step back and assess whether we can focus our limited resources and capacities where our role can have the most impact and is unique. The support for open government by governments themselves help to reduce the barriers at times for achieving proactive publication. And in some respects, this allows information commissioners and other ATI guarantee bodies to shift our capacity to areas where government may be more reluctant to provide public access to information. The ATI guarantee bodies are also in a position to collect data on the use and effectiveness of the implementation of ATI laws. And UNESCO has entered into an agreement with the ICIC to help facilitate this information sharing and help to collectively assess gaps on an international level. Tools like the Carter Center's Implementation Assessment Tool and others that have been developed have identified core metrics to measure the quality of the implementation again, and such work should be expanded on an international and regional standards are established. You'll see in the strategic plan for the ICIC an emphasis on developing more extensive international standards on ATI practice, as well as the strengthening of regional networks, and I'm hopeful about the impact of this work. So in closing, there is always room for policy framework improvements, always. But in the current state of the world, I have some concern that we need to focus and continue to focus our attention on the standards for implementing ATI policy and legal frameworks to ensure the aspirations they espouse do not stray too far from the reality of citizens' experiences when exercising their rights.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
Greetings from the United States of America. I am Alina Simo, Director of the Office of Government Information Services at the National Archives and Records Administration, the Federal Freedom of Information Act Ombudsman. I am pleased to participate remotely in this afternoon's panel on the policy framework for ATI in the global arena, paradigm shift and reforms. And I'm sorry I cannot be there in person. Of the three suggested prompts, the one that resonated with me the most was the third one. Is a paradigm shift reform of the current emerging global ATI framework needed? What are the gaps, opportunities, and challenges in the development of an inclusive global framework? I would like to offer the perspective of the United States and what we are experiencing with a significant uptick in first-party requests for access to information, in particular, immigration-related records. By the way, today's panel is taking place during a nationally recognized holiday in the United States of America, Juneteenth. It was recognized as an official federal government holiday only 2 years ago. Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day or Emancipation Day, commemorates the emancipation of enslaved African Americans and recognizes the day when news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached the state of Texas in 1865, 2.5 years after it was originally issued. Juneteenth serves as an important time for reflection on the progress that has been made towards racial justice and equality, as well as a reminder of the work that still needs to be done to address systemic racism and create a more inclusive society, both here in the United States and globally. There is an indirect connection between the Juneteenth holiday and immigrants wanting to come to the United States, as both topics have relevance to the broader themes of freedom, equality, and the pursuit of a better life. How does that relate to ATI, you may ask? I want to turn to a phenomenon that we have been experiencing in the United States for several years now, a significant increase in information requests made by individuals seeking access to their own records, or what we refer to as first-party requests. And in particular, we have seen significant growth in the area of first-party requests for immigration records. Access to information is crucial for individuals involved in immigration proceedings in the United States. Individuals involved in immigration proceedings or their legal representatives can submit FOIA requests to government agencies such as the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, or Customs and Border Protection, CBP, to obtain specific documents or information relevant to their case. This can include immigration records, applications, or other documentation that can assist in building a defense or understanding their case history. The annual statistics bear this out. This past fiscal year, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, including its agency components of USCIS, ICE, and CBP, accounted for 58% of all FOIA or ATI requests submitted across the entire federal government. DHS's numbers have steadily increased in the last decade. In 2012, requests made to DHS accounted for only 29% of access to information requests made across the federal government. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and as we have entered the next phase, the endemic, the top concern of requesters continues to be delays. Of the over 4,500 requests for assistance our office received last year, A significant number concerned delayed FOIA requests, and in particular, access to immigration records. This is not surprising, as the federal government nears 1 million requests for access to information annually. The backlog of pending requests has also increased considerably, up nearly 35% from the previous year. With such a significant increase in backlogs, it is no surprise that so many of the cases our office has been receiving are from requesters who are frustrated because their request is sitting in a growing backlog not being addressed. All of these backlog delays have practical consequences, particularly for those seeking access to immigration records. While I cannot speak to gaps in the global ATI framework, our FOIA system in the United States is not perfect. Implementation and enforcement is difficult, particularly for non-citizen individuals who do not have the benefit of being represented by legal counsel. As I mentioned earlier, timely access to information is crucial for individuals involved in immigration proceedings in the United States. Because FOIA requests are often not met with an adequate response time, individuals often file requests with multiple agencies to see which one responds the fastest. In the case of immigration files, even when the information is consolidated from multiple government agencies in the hands of one agency, requesters must sometimes file access requests with each agency individually, nevertheless. If an individual requester is stuck in a long agency backlog, they may not be able to get access to important information they need, such as a notice to appear, case updates, and notifications. Language barriers also exist, which make ATI challenging. We were very pleased when we hired a new staff member last year who is fluent in Spanish. He has been able to translate many requests for assistance from Spanish to English so that we may better assist these individuals. These requesters also face a digital divide, including limited internet access and lower digital literacy rates, which further hinder their ability to access the information they need. Finally, the government responds to most first-party FOIA requests in a reactive manner. There is no mechanism for proactive disclosure of immigration records. In March 2022, the Attorney General of the United States issued new FOIA guidelines to all government agencies. The guidelines encourage federal agencies to continue their efforts to remove barriers to requesting and accessing government records and to reduce FOIA processing backlogs. The guidelines specifically cite the Justice Department's Executive Office for Immigration Review, EOIR, an office that has long required individuals to file FOIA requests to obtain official copies of their own records of immigration court proceedings. The guidelines announced a change in EOIR's access policy, and that office now allows access to immigration court proceedings without the need to file a FOIA request. USCIS, ICE, and CBP would need to follow suit and make immigration records accessible without requiring individuals to file FOIA requests. There are a number of challenges in designing a system to access first-party immigration information outside of the FOIA framework, including technological and human resources underpinned by funding. But with challenges come a number of opportunities, all worth exploring. These would include the need to update legal access frameworks that may be more aligned with international standards and promoting greater transparency and accountability. Thank you for your time today.
A return to our roots, I think we can say. And I think that's an important thing for information commissioners to be considering at a time when, as Peter Belli pointed out, there's lots of pressures and initiatives, whether they're sectoral for open contracting or contracted industries, and the Open Government Partnership, to lose sight potentially of the fundamental rights-based approach of people getting information they want it, not when it's convenient for the government to make it available. So, drawing this session to a close, and I think we won't have time for a lead in the video, but I think it will probably be made available on the website afterwards. I'm not sure it's a simple matter to sum this up, because there are variations around the world in approaches to this. We can see, broadly speaking, you've got first generation, second generation laws based on a pull model and push model supplementing that pull facility. We've perhaps seen freedom of information originally rooted in human rights norms. And while those are still fundamental to the operation of the laws, in some ways, some of the discourse has moved beyond that. We see that the Sustainable Development Goals and the indicators around enactment of FOI laws, part of the SDGs, that they're seen as part of a package of achieving sustainable development overall, that it's an enabling instrument, not simply here's a human rights norm. And people have raised the issue that there are changing public expectations around public participation. A lot of the time, discussion around freedom of information focuses on accountability of government. But New Zealand's law, which is one of those old laws from 40 years ago, its first listed purpose is to enable people's effective participation in the making and administration of laws and policies. Accountability of ministers and officials is the second purpose. And so ideas around enabling public participation is not necessarily a new thing that's come along with the OGP in the last 10 years. But there are implications of saying freedom of information is an instrument, not just a human rights norm. Because if we say it's an instrument for achieving outcomes, what are those metrics? We're moving beyond just activity metrics or requests and complaints, but what are we actually achieving? What are the development outcomes if we say freedom of information is a development tool? What has been achieved, what has changed? And achieving these outcomes is critical. What's critical for achieving those outcomes is the quality of implementation and enforcement by information commissioners. This in some ways is their key role in that process. If not, we have, as Jean-Claude mentioned, the risk of performative freedom of information, where treaties are signed, laws are passed, but people do not actually get the benefit of those rights in practice. And this is the case whether we're talking about upholding freedom of information as a human right or as a tool to assist with sustainable development. So I'd like to thank you all for your joining us in this session and to the organisers for inviting us to such an interesting discussion, and to my panelists. Thank you all for your very interesting